And Garrett, one of the characteristics of Joe Biden as president has been his confidence that he could work deals on the budget, even when he couldn't, because Mitch McConnell was his counterpart in the Senate, because they had done it for years and years on the Hill, because he did represent that old guard in the Senate. You know, and Brendan is absolutely right. The Senate has changed. It is more like the House. The initial time it changed was really in 1994, when Sam Nunn and a lot of the other old guard stepped down, and eventually, you know, the Newt Gingriches took over on the House side, and it opened up room in the Senate after those Senate retirements for a lot of House members to move up to the Senate, Trent Lott and others. And it just did begin to change the character of the Senate, but it really did change in the last couple of years.
Absolutely it has, but it has still very much been the cooling saucer of government as it was designed, a process that frustrated, I'm thinking, the last two Democratic presidents to great end, that they couldn't move through things that even had significant popular support because of the essentially protections for the minority within the Senate. That has lasted up until now, through now. McConnell, as all of our viewers will remember, was one of the most vocal proponents of protecting the filibuster for legislation, a 60-vote threshold for legislation, despite being perfectly comfortable lowering it for Supreme Court nominations and for other nominees in the executive and judicial branches. That inconsistently was something that always drove his critics crazy. But he was also someone who could work across the aisle when necessary. He talks all the time about the difference between making a law and making a point. And whatever else you thought about his politics, he understood the differences quite clearly. During the Obama administration, Joe Biden, who had that decades-long relationship with McConnell, was often dispatched to negotiate with him directly. And Republicans have complained that during the Biden administration, there is no Joe Biden who can come to the Senate and negotiate with McConnell and senators in that same way. So unique and so deep was that relationship between the two men, who, even when they've been at each other's throats about policy, have maintained that they are friends. I would not be surprised at all to hear President Biden speak highly of Mitch McConnell even today, even despite all of the things on which McConnell and his Republican conference, a bare minority of them in some cases, have frustrated this president. That dynamic will change, obviously, with a new Republican leader, be it a minority leader or a majority leader. We can debate how much it will change, perhaps depending on who the next president is and who, if it's one of the three Johns I just laid out or someone else takes the reins. But that change is inevitable, and it comes to the Senate, however slowly.
And so he talked about the fact that he's 82, Brendan, and he has notably had two instances of remarkable health challenges, you know, in public, on camera, which would have felled another person, but he plowed ahead and came back strong. And one of the people at his side, the first time that happened, was, of course, Senator John Barrasso, who is a doctor, and helped walk him off camera there when he was in the hallway at what we call the Ohio clock. It was really a notable moment, you know, long moment of silence, and he seemed to be frozen. They denied that there was any real problem, but he's had his own health challenges, and then this terrible loss in their family just in the past couple of weeks.
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the realities is I think there are not a lot of people who are surprised that he was leaving. You know, we've seen what's happened since he had that bad fall, and a lot of people, I think, were expecting him to be on the way out. But there also is a dynamic that's been going on with the Senate conference that we shouldn't overlook either. There has been a lot more sniping at him than you used to see. There are a new breed of senators, whether they're talking about Josh Hawley or J.D. Vance or even Senator Lee from Utah, who have been pretty openly critical of his leadership of late. And it feels like while his health is also clearly an issue, he probably recognizes that there's a new type of senator, and they're probably looking for a more Trump-like leader. I think that's going to be a fascinating dynamic, whoever comes in next. Like I said, McConnell has had a pretty firm grip on this conference, and nobody was really challenging him for many, many years. I imagine whoever is next is not going to have such an easy time managing this conference. It feels like it's going to be more of that party dynamic that we've seen in the House, where you're always having to worry about what Donald Trump says. The daily swings of politics are going to make operating the body much more difficult. He really was that sturdy leader. You know, you go into meetings with this person, and you know, my old boss would come in and want to make jokes and you know, talk about what's going on in the news, and he would largely just kind of sit there and wait for the speaker to be done talking, and then get down to business. I mean, this is a person really focused on every little thing that you need to do to keep the Senate moving along. And he eats, sleeps, breathes this body, and did not let politics get in the way of what he wanted to do. I worry that we're entering a new phase where that kind of leadership is just simply not possible, and it's going to end up being much more Trumpy. It's going to be much more entertainment politics. And I worry about the ability to do those really hard governing things that you have to do, pass those debt limit deals, pass those funding deals that are always really unpopular, and having a leader willing to say, I don't care if it's unpopular, I'm doing what I need to do. I think there will be long-term repercussions for how the Senate is run.
And Garrett and Brendan, if you'll stand by for a moment, we're fortunately joined also by former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuade, and the author of Attack from Within, How Disinformation is Sabotaging America. Barbara, thanks for jumping in here. I'm going to talk to you about the book, but let's talk about Mitch McConnell, because Garrett Haake was speaking in the moments after, you know, McConnell announced this, that perhaps his largest impact, and I agree entirely with Garrett's take on this, is his impact on the law, on the Supreme Court. Because none of us knew, I thought I knew Senate procedure, none of us knew that you could stop Merrick Garland, a Senate nominee, at the beginning, it was February, the beginning of a re-election year, from even getting heard, having meetings on the Hill. He couldn't get a hearing. And to stop that and open the door to, once Donald Trump was elected, you know, 3 nominations to the Supreme Court, and all of those decisions, most notably Dobbs, but others as well.
Well, to many of us in the law, Mitch McConnell's legacy will forever be tainted by what he did with the Supreme Court. As you said, when Antonin Scalia died, insisting that that seat be held open past the November election to let the people decide who should pick the next Supreme Court justice. And of course, that ended up being Trump, and robbing Merrick Garland of an opportunity to fill that seat. But then when we saw the tables turned and Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, just 6 weeks before the election.
It was October.
Just weeks away. Mitch McConnell said, no, actually, you know what? That the long tradition I mentioned before, it's different when, you know, it happens on a Thursday. He was, you know, very hypocritical then, and allowed Donald Trump to replace that seat. So he got both, the one that was before his presidency and the one that was at the tail end of his presidency. And I think, although he had the power to do that, one of the things that's so important, and in fact I talk about in my book, is the need for people to exercise restraint when they have power, not to exercise power simply because they can, but to show restraint and working with the other side of the aisle in being fair and just so that people have confidence in our institutions.
Now, I want to talk about some of the other legal ramifications of all of this, but joining us now on the phone happily is former Senator from Missouri, Claire McCaskill. Claire, you worked opposite and in some cases alongside Mitch McConnell. Talk to me about Mitch McConnell and the way he pulled the levers of power in his sort of laconic, low-key way.
Well, he's a consummate LBJ type leader. In other words, he knows how to count votes. He knows how to leverage members. He knows how to gain power. In fact, he would consider it a compliment that I would say that his career has been about leveraging power, whether it is decimating campaign finance laws or changing every norm about the nomination of a Supreme Court justice. But make no mistake about this, Andrea, this is a very strategic announcement because he is trying to gain the majority and trying to navigate the Trump problem. And to do that, he needs to husband the forces within his caucus to keep a pro-Trump extremist from becoming the leader if the Republicans take the Senate in November. So he is trying to accomplish 2 or 3 things at once with announcing it the way he has and when he has.
And Barbara McQuade, one other legal ramification that we should talk about is impeachment, because remember his speech saying in the second impeachment, you know, there's a place you can prosecute him after he leaves office. And then, of course, silence when Donald Trump claims that he has lifetime immunity after he leaves office.
Using sort of a procedural bait and switch, I think, by giving people cover to not vote to convict when Donald Trump was there. The Senate had the power to prevent him from ever holding office again, and saying there's a time and place to deal with this. That's criminal prosecution. And then when criminal prosecution comes along, of course, there are those who say that can't be done because a president has immunity and because he wasn't convicted. It's a double jeopardy violation. And Mitch McConnell has remained silent throughout that. So I think in many ways he has undermined public confidence in our institutions, in our courts, and in the Senate.